And I think through that experience of being really vulnerable in the anticipatory grief and the grief after has blossomed even more vulnerability with my friendships to this day. And it's hard. Grief is such a unique experience. One of the many things I learned from it is how isolating it is.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Masking Tapes. Today, I'm embarking on a conversation with Ryan Drysdale about what it means to grieve as a man in the 21st century. I first met Ryan in 2020, and throughout these very challenging years, Ryan has continued to show up for me as a mentor, and now with his vulnerability on this episode. On this episode, I talk with Ryan about how he navigated the grief that followed and preempted the loss of his father 2 years ago, and how he was able to lean on the people around him, especially a group of guy friends, to support him in being vulnerable throughout this process. So I'm so excited to get started. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, well, it's so great to be with you, Carolina, and seeing this project come to life, and really honored to be a guest here today in this conversation with you. And yeah, I live in Washington, D.C., worked in nonpartisan voter engagement for the last 8 years. Before that, some international development work, grew up in the Midwest and have called many places and still call many places home across the U.S. and abroad.
It's an honor to have you, so thank you for being here. Ryan and I have had many a conversation about masculinity in the past, and our conversations are something that usually I leave and I think, oh my God, I need to start a podcast. And it was actually after our conversation in December that I was like, I just wish I had that conversation on record, because we dive deep, and I'm just really excited now to finally be recording it with you. So as always, can we start off with, what are some of the hardest things about being a man?
Yeah, I feel lucky to know this question's coming from previous conversations we've had where we've talked about this. And reflecting on that, I think one of the hardest things from a growing up perspective is realizing that there were not a lot of examples of men in the mainstream or in my personal life who had a compassionate sense of authenticity in their life, of a true sense of their self that wasn't so formed by the culture we were in, a paternalistic, capitalistic, materialistic, militaristic, white Judeo-Christian Midwest upbringing. A big exception to that being my dad, which I'm sure will come up more later. But we had these symbols of what masculinity and manliness were, from athletes to soldiers, police, firefighters, and a lot of them play important roles in our community. And we've seen problematic roles from those types of figures in our communities. And when we talk about masculinity, what are the positive, healthy, whole, compassionate, authentic sense of what it is to be a man?
So how did you figure out who your models for masculinity were going to be in a world where there were so many maybe anti-role models as well?
I don't know if I have an answer to that question. It's a really profound question, and it makes me think that a lot of what I have come to learn about being a man and masculinity has come from women and non-binary people in my life who I've been able to see masculinity through their experience in their eyes. And I would say at least half, maybe more than half of my closest friends that I'm regularly texting, calling, sending cards with are women. And that experience, I feel like, is quite rare for a man. And it has given me a huge insight, a valuable insight that I think a lot of men haven't had, of what the lived experience for people who interact with men can be like. Their fears of walking down the street at night, or being in a room in a meeting with men and, having to feel you're always talked over, all these classic and other examples, big and small. So it is, I think, through the women in my life that I've learned more about masculinity. And then later in my life, reflecting on the type of man that my dad was and how he didn't quite fit that mold. And so I think a lot of credit needs to be given to him for the model that I could see counter to what a lot of the culture I grew up through really showed what it can be to be a compassionate, authentic man.
Wow. And can you elaborate a little bit more on the model of your dad and how that differed from a lot of the other sources in your life? And
when I think of time with my dad growing up, there was a tenderness and there's always a comfort, whether we were going fishing and, the quiet of being next to each other, standing on the shore, casting for fish or golfing, playing games or reading. I just always felt at ease with him. There wasn't a sense of bravado or having to show the strength through certain actions, and seeing that play out when I was with him and other people. And oftentimes he would take a quieter role. He wouldn't want to have to compete for attention with others. And I think of an example my mom tells often when she was going through treatment for cancer, and the chemo just, especially back in that day, just really wrecks you so much, and just so much pain, no energy. My dad would come home from work, about an hour commute one way, and there was one day he comes home, starts peeling potatoes, throws them in a pot, boils them, goes upstairs, changes out of his suit, comes back down, and makes hand-breaded chicken strips and mashed potatoes. And my mom's like, it's a Wednesday. It's like, I couldn't think of anything else to cook, and I'm sick of everything else I cooked, so this is what we're having for dinner tonight. And he had already worked such a long day, already being a caregiver for my mom and us three boys. And, without question, the first thing he does when he gets home is, starts to cook. And that was not an outlier. My parents owned a cafe, and my mom would wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning to start baking all the fresh goods and cooking food and on her feet all day. That more often than not, my dad was the one that would cook dinner. A lot of the different labor around the house, it was just really more evenly divided. We as boys were expected to do things. It wasn't just my dad mows the lawn and my mom does the laundry. And that wasn't something I fully realized until later in life, and looking back at how we grew up and the roles that my dad and, the men in the house played seemed to be different than some of the houses when I would go and visit friends and see what those dynamics were like.
I think that what's beautiful about what your dad modeled there is that it wasn't just for him. He has 3 sons that could have grown up so differently. And so being able to impart into this next generation these values of compassionate masculinity, of caregiving masculinity too, to 3 sons, it could have just been a totally different dynamic in that house. And I often think a lot of this world has to do with father-son relationships, whether it's our politicians and their relationships with their father, them playing out in the way that they treat the rest of the world, or in our relationships with partners especially. And this is a little side note, but I remember watching How to Train Your Dragon recently and thinking about that relationship between the father and the son, and his expectations of hardening a son that wanted to be vulnerable and wanted to befriend something that was seen as violent, and thinking about how one of the biggest storylines that you can keep seeing over and over again in film is expectations from fathers that don't align with the tenderness of their sons until their sons become hard too. And what happened with you and your father was something that was completely opposite to that kind of narrative that over and over is told of a father who wants to harden his son.
That really encapsulates the experience. My dad tended to my tenderness, and it was celebrated, and there were not expectations put on me that didn't align with, I felt like I could explore who I wanted to be, and that was celebrated. And I knew always that my dad and my mom, I don't want to leave her out of this, but I always knew they were proud of me, and I always knew they loved me. Even when it came time to discipline was more of a learning point and not a punitive power. I think that having someone so influential in your life, and a male figure who is helping to create space for you to be gentle, kind, and vulnerable, is one of the greatest gifts that I've received, and has allowed me to explore vulnerability in more places in my life, with male friendships in particular, with my partner, in work settings. And it's hard and scary when you're first starting it and you hear those adages that, vulnerability is strength. And it really takes a level of strength and courage to be vulnerable, to be authentically yourself, whether you're celebrating the greatest joys or when you are going through some of the hardships in life, and not just hardening it and doing that, Midwestern cowboy grin and bear it. And to have the seeds planted in me to be able to acknowledge what feelings I'm feeling inside, let them rise up and share those, especially in recent years, the hard things we've gone through as a society. And my dad passed almost 2 years ago to the day, was really just a great gift to allow me to explore vulnerability in my life, which has then reaped so much deeper connection with people in my life, a greater sense of meaning and purpose, and a greater sense of calm.
First of all, I just appreciate the calling into your family, whether physically present in your life right now or not, and thinking about those examples. What a way to honor your father, to bring in his wisdom and share it with people. Whoever knows you knows about the role that your dad played in your life. And I've just seen you post about it too on social media in a vulnerable way too. And I think right now in this society has turned back to the idea that when men are emotional, it's a weak thing. Recently, I was having a conversation with a family member, and he was like, yeah, we have too many quote unquote soy boys in this world right now. And this idea of like weak men who are too emotional. And that is the reason why we are crumbling as a society, is because men have been weakened and men need to fight more, he said. And I think what you are sharing is a very strong counter to this narrative that emotional vulnerability is weakness. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've seen your vulnerability as something that has strengthened you, and also as women to be able to receive the emotional vulnerability of male friends and partners is something that we need to work on too, because we've been taught that, oh no, men don't share their emotions, and all of a sudden it's whiplash when they do.
I think a great benefit I've had, as I touched on earlier, is having strong friendships with a lot of different women growing up. Those are the spaces that I was vulnerable in earliest. And then being vulnerable with me, there's a beautiful reciprocity that vulnerability begets vulnerability. And when you introduce that into a friendship, a friend group, it can start to really blossom and invites others to come into that space. It's something I learned early on, that then I would sometimes intentionally offer a nugget of vulnerability into a conversation, hoping that it would then create a pathway for the other person to be vulnerable with me, either in that moment or down the road. And so having, that learning that wisdom from some of the women in my life has been a huge credit I owe to them, because now it's showing up more in my male friendships, where when my dad unexpectedly got sick just over 2 years ago, it was female friends and male friends who were there for me and sharing. And I think through that experience of being really vulnerable in the anticipatory grief and the grief after, has blossomed even more vulnerability with my male friendships to this day. And it's hard. Grief is such a unique experience that you can, maybe much like parenthood and other things, you can read as many books as you want, but until you go through it, there's not a whole lot you can do to prepare yourself for what you're going to experience. And one of the many things I learned from it is how isolating it is. And going into grief, I knew I had such strong friendships and relationships with people physically nearby and across the country. And in the depths of grief, it's so isolating, it can be hard to reach out. There'd be times that I knew, as one of my dear guy friends always says, better out than in. Just get it out there, you're going to feel better. And I knew that, and I would have a text drafted to a friend or a friend group thread. And it was so hard for me to put my finger on that little arrow. And I would be doing that. I remember vividly one time riding a train up north to visit my mother-in-law with my wife. And my wife's sitting right next to me, and I'm trying to draft this text. I have like tears rolling down my face because I'm just feeling this intense wave of grief. And I can't even reach over in that moment and, put my hand on her thigh and be like, it's here right now. Absolutely, she knows this is going on too, because she's observing my energy and she sees me, and knowing I have such a loving partner who anything I need to share, I can share. And in those times, it can be so hard. And it really, things I learned from that relate to growing up as a boy into a man of, in general society, how hard it is to share what you're feeling. Even if you're not grieving, there is a comparison there for me. And how do we make those pathways easier? Where does that first nugget of vulnerability fall in a friendship or a group friendship to allow men to be more vulnerable, to be more emotional? And I don't necessarily have the answer to that other than people who are listening, men in your life, tell your friends how you're feeling. And it takes a better listener too. And I think something that often comes from men is wanting to solve problems. You're hearing something, you care so deeply about the person, I want to offer solutions. And knowing, do you want an ear or do you want a solution? Do you just need to get it out? And you don't need to problem solve right now? Because sometimes just getting it out relieves so much.
I can also understand that feeling of like, do I even want to share this? Do I want to bring another person down with me into this grieving portion? Or can I just like hold this in and channel it on my own? We are supposed to grieve in community. As human beings, we are not supposed to be grieving alone. And somehow we got lost along the way where we decided that grief was something that was reserved for 3 days of bereavement from work, whereas ancient traditions and other countries in the world have ideas of like 40 days of grieving or a year of that spurs people to love deeper and form deeper relationships. And I think one thing I'm wondering is, what advice would you give a man or young man right now that is either preparing to go through grief or is in the depths of grief right now?
Time is a healer. It can be a healer. Where what I'm feeling and carrying with me now with my grief compared to a year ago, compared to 2 years ago, it's a small pebble in my pocket that I can hold and handle and bring back thoughts and feelings. It's still sometimes some waves. Felt a wave of grief on a 2-year anniversary just the other day, but it was a day as opposed to a week or a month as it was earlier. So, grief is the price we pay for love. Lean into the feelings. I think they're hard, uncomfortable feelings. And whether it's grief or any other emotion, I think this rings true, that there are ways to try to avoid it, to numb it. That's only going to delay, bury, and hide it. You will need to process your grief in some way at some time. And there's no time like the present. It's hard, but the more you sit with it, let the feelings move through you, name the feelings, share those feelings, whether just in writing to yourself or others, the more you are going to experience and process that grief, that will have you come out transformed in a healthier, more holistic side than if you try to avoid it. Anderson Cooper has a fantastic podcast all about grief, and one of his themes is how he delayed his grief for decades from multiple episodes of loss in his life. And through that, he realized he wasn't feeling the full extent of the sadness and other feelings in that realm, which prevented him from feeling the fullest extent of joy. There is a balance and reciprocity in those emotions. And the deeper we can lean into heartache, I have felt a deeper sense of love in other elements of relationships that I have. So lean into that grief, reach out for help too. The Dinner Party is a group that I've been involved in that hosts tables for fellow young grievers to get together. Lots of great books, podcasts, finding healthy outlets, going on walks, listening to music. But it takes time. You cannot rush grief. And people experience grief differently. And I know people who had a loss similar to mine that maybe it was only months later that they were feeling like themselves. It was over 1.5 years before I truly felt like myself again. And that can be hard to accept. But once I realized this is a season that I'm in and I have to be in it, it allowed me to be present, feel these feelings. And through that, I have deeper sense of love and connection for so much more around me than I did on the other side.
I think it's such a great point you make. To grieve is to actually set yourself up for greater love too. Like you said, it's the price of love, but I also think it's love left over. So every time you feel those waves of grief, and they transform over time, they're just another expression of like, damn, I wish I could be be giving you this love in person right now. And when my uncle passed away in 2020, when I moved down to Florida to take care of my grandfather, some of my uncle's journals were there. And I remember flipping through them, and he'd gone on a grief retreat after the passing of my grandmother that hit him incredibly hard. And in one of those pages of his journal on grieving, he had written, "I want to sit in the fire of grief long enough and with enough intention to be an instrument of peace." And I remember just like holding that journal and thinking, oh my goodness, like he really thought about grief as like a fire that could mold you into an instrument of peace in this world. Then the need for intentional grieving could bring people together and then be a spur of action as a source of strength and not as a source of weakness. I think that is something that I just hope becomes more normalized in this world. So I guess one of my other questions for you is, what advice would you give someone whose friend is going through anticipatory grieving or is in the depths of grief right now, who maybe sees their friend is numbing themselves or looking for other outlets?
From my experience, grief wants to be seen and acknowledged. And with the 2-year anniversary of my dad having just passed recently, I had a number of friends reach out via text. A few wrote me cards acknowledging the date, the feelings around it, so many things. They were all female friends. So my male friends have done wonderful things during the grieving experience as well. But to me, it's a lesson of we as men can do more. And acknowledging that grief, I think one of the easiest things to do is put the date in your calendar so you remember it. So when that date's coming up, you can acknowledge it with that text, that call, sending a letter, because the body keeps the score with any type of experience. Trauma, grief is no different. That I knew the day before the anniversary, I was probably going to feel in a funk that day. I felt fine going to bed and I woke up just in a funk, nothing I could control. That is grief. So people are going to still feel these things years after. My partner lost her father when she was 4 years old. And that day is still a day she feels, even all these years later. So as a male friend, keeping those dates in mind, being a grief buddy, for me, it was 2 years. As I had mentioned before, I was really starting to feel myself again, checking in from time to time of whether it's Father's Day in particular, or, hey, just thinking of you and your dad. If there's anything you want to share, any stories, it's camping season for us in our friend group. Did you have any great stories camping? Giving the person the opportunity to share, with that balance of not putting them on that spot. Because there's times I would love to talk about my dad, and there's some times I'm going to be like, not right now. Thank you for asking and acknowledging that. But I think there's the initial phase when there's a loss that there's so much attention to you, and something my mother-in-law has talked about after the loss of her husband was what happens when the casseroles stop coming, and be that person that then continues to show up and acknowledge that this grief will forever be with me for the rest of my life. It won't need the same attention as more time passes, but in those early days, months, and even years, it is one of the most prominent themes in my life for the last 2 years. That's something I want to be able to share. And having shared that with some of my male friends, I think is one of the factors that has led to a deepening of our friendships and vulnerability, where we're not just catching up on the news and facts of our lives, but it's how we're feeling about things, and sharing our feelings with each other. And I think, a text I just received the other day from one of my friends on a group text was saying he had just hung out with one of our other friends. And he said, we ended the night by talking about how incredible it is to have such a close group of friends that make an effort to be together. It's not every day these kinds of friendships come together. Love the hell out of you guys. And our friends, more now than ever, we end text and phone calls with love you. I love you. How are you doing? And there's a deeper sense of vulnerability that, to your point earlier, of the softness, we need men to be stronger. We need to be stronger through vulnerability and true connections. So when my friends are going through hard times, I can acknowledge and see what they are experiencing, because most times that's what we need the most, is just an acknowledgement of, I see you. I see what you're going through. And then the taking it further of, what is it you need right now? Which asking that question of what can I do for you also puts the burden on the griever of getting to that sense of knowing, do you need some food? Do you need laundry done? Do you need someone just to show up and sit? We don't have to talk at all. I'll just be there in your physical presence. So going through this grieving experience has helped me become more empathetic. And in that, I think I am now stronger because I'm more also aware. I see a stranger on the street. I can see a glint in their eye and I think, oh, that person might be grieving. Or approaching people with the assumption that they are grieving and bringing that level of kindness is going to make us a more connected community.
I completely agree with that. And I think one of the things that I'm wondering is how do you share your grief with the people you're close with, but in a way that sustains and deepens those relationships and doesn't harm them?
Women in heterosexual relationships are carrying additional labor in many ways, and one in particular is an emotional labor, where they are serving as therapists for their partners. And that can be a natural flow in a relationship. But when I look at my wife and my female friends, they have a communal network of therapy amongst each other, of showing up for them as individuals and in groups when one is going through a hard thing, or 5 of them together and all 5 of them are having a hard time. They all talk about it in that hangout that lasts a really long time face to face. Men need to do that more and take that labor off of the shoulders of the women of their life to show up for your friend, not expecting that, their girlfriend, their wife has that covered. And so often the situation where the man comes back from hanging out with their friends and, how's Chad doing? What's up with his job? I don't know. We didn't talk about that. Asking those questions, men want to talk about that. And that doesn't even have to be a hard, big emotional question to talk about a job and what's stressful with it. And that can be an entryway into a deeper thing of how are you in your relationship? How are you feeling with the relationship with your parents? Your parents are aging, etc. It's a gateway into those deeper, more complex conversations. And men need to show up for each other more and take away some of that extra emotional labor we're putting on the women in our lives.
I couldn't agree more. And I remember one of my former boyfriends, we got in this conversation because I was like, I feel like I'm your therapist right now. And like, I can be your best friend, but I need you to distribute this weight of all that you are carrying with some other people too, because I can't be the only one. I was like, when I'm going through a tough time, I talk to you, but I also talk to family members. I also talk to friends. I talk to my cousin. And I get different nuggets of wisdom from all these different people in my life. And I'm able to distribute this weight. And I think that that's something that I think would strengthen a lot of male-female relationships if the female partner didn't feel like she had to bear the weight of therapists too all the time. And that's not to say men shouldn't be vulnerable with their partners or that it's a sign of over-dependency. No, it's be vulnerable, but I want you to be just as vulnerable as you are with me with at least one other of your guy friends right now, because we need to share this as a village.
And it creates a wonderful network that you can then workshop. Here's a situation in my life and I'm trying to understand her perspective and how do I want to approach this, and getting that outside counsel of your friend who might know you both very well or can hopefully provide some objective insights or even just support. We also need to seek external professional help, and the stigma around therapy needs to change. It took me 3 tries to find a therapist that really was the match and the fit that I needed for that point in my life. And I'm at a point now where I don't need to go as often as I did, but having that is so fantastic because it has probably taken a burden off of my partner and things that I would have only talked about with them. And it helps me become more refined with some things to my partner. And therapy, it can be so beneficial and transformational, and that stigma needs to go away because men are leaving a helpful resource on the table that can help them get to a path of just a calmer sense in life and a better understanding of themselves and the world around them. And I think one of the last points I'll share on that thread too, of this community of grieving in the workplace, where then it's get back to work, get your work done. I am so fortunate to work on a team and an organization that created that space. It wasn't just 3 days of bereavement. I had paid family leave leading up to his death as a caregiver through our organization and through the DC government. And after he died, my boss said, take the time, tell me when you need to come back. It was 2 weeks before I came back. And even then I was on a very limited schedule. And it was over a year after he passed that every so often in a one-on-one, my boss would hold space and time of, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about grief right now? And creating space in that we would talk about that. I had colleagues who would acknowledge it. I remember it coming into a team meeting maybe 2 months after being back to work. And someone asked, how are you doing? Just generally to everyone. And I just started breaking down crying. And their immediate response was, what's on Ryan's schedule? What can we move? What do we need to take off? Ryan, take the rest of the day off. And just and it might not be a coincidence that I work exclusively, my team is all women at this point in time. So bringing that level of care brings such a strength to our team and to us as individuals. And I think that's a number, hopefully, of examples of ways that men can show up for other men, but show up for anyone who's grieving. Just that one text of, I'm sorry for your loss, that is just the start of the ways you can continue to show up and see the grief that your friend is experiencing.
There's so many pieces of wisdom there of ways in friendships, in the workplace, in the family, with strangers, that you can just look to someone and think about, like, okay, even if I don't know how to show up for you right now, let me do something. And I think sometimes that fear of getting it wrong, of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing, paralyzes people into doing nothing. And then instead that adds to the harm, and people just want to know that you care about them. I want to go back a little bit to your conversation about your group of male friends. How did you guys get to the point where you are ending your conversations and texts with "I love you"?
Yeah, I would love to have them on these microphones too, to get their take of where they think that's come from. And, some of it is a length of friendship, but I also think you can have 30-year-long friendship and you never say "I love you" to the other person. And I really think it comes back to that vulnerability. And I think that goes back again to my dad tending that garden of kindness and what people might call a softness, and allowed me to be more in touch with my emotions. And I think I could look back at text messages from before my dad died and after to see maybe that was a transformational point. And when I started sharing more about the grieving process with him, that the barriers have broken down, where it doesn't feel awkward to say that. It feels so nice to know multiple people love you. And I think in male spaces in particular, there's still a strong sense of homophobia. That as a straight man, if I say I love you to my friend, people are going to think you're gay, and the assumption that being gay is bad or wrong. And that is definitely still a barrier in male friendships. I think an early step for us was hugging each other when we would see each other, and not just, some kind of quick bro hug, but holding you for a second or a minute, and all of us just being more vulnerable in places and sharing how we're feeling about things in our lives has created such an ease to which we can now share the highs and lows of life that's been going on. And it takes a level of mindfulness in each individual and in your friend to pause, and with that mindfulness, pairing it with some empathy to think about what is the other person experiencing, what is it that they might need in this moment, and how can I show in an action as simple as a text, putting a little bit more effort into it to make sure that they know how I'm feeling about them.
Wow. You outline it so well, this idea these little actions can amount up to changing and transforming a whole relationship. I really appreciate that wisdom of how to show up with your male friendships.
And I think showing up it is really a key word there. It makes me think back to how did we get to where we are in our friendships? And we make an effort to go see each other. We all, a group of 3 of us in particular, all used to live 2 blocks away from each other. And I was roommates with one of them. And then I moved to DC and another one moved to Texas. And we still see each other multiple times a year. And it can be easy for some of my other friendships that can go years in between see each other, and you see each other and it's like, how did so much time go by? We didn't prioritize to see each other and how we see each other. In your first episode, and you and I've talked about this before, the side-by-side of how men develop friendships, boys, and face-to-face for girls, realizing we have a lot more face-to-face time too. Some of that's centered around playing a board game or just sitting on a couch and catching up, doing activities that the primary purpose, whether we know it or not, is connecting, sharing, and engaging, as opposed to having some activity that the conversation is secondary, playing a video game, going out. And you can go play a round of golf with a friend and have it be a time where you are really connecting deeply, or that you are just there in each other's space talking about the latest thing you saw on Twitter. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But every time we show up with each other, how we show up, we can choose to the depth that we're going to connect with someone in that space. And having eye contact is a huge part of getting into the other person's soul. And it can be so awkward to maintain long eye contact, sharing silence with someone. You don't always have to just fill that space. And if you can get comfortable looking at someone and having silence with them, you're going to know their soul pretty soon.
I love that. And I think that the eye contact piece is a huge one that I've been noticing recently. And my conversations with my female friends versus my male friends, have seen the ways that a lot of my male friends avert their eye contact instead of being able to sit down, and especially watching other men talk to each other and being like, why aren't you guys looking at each other right now? But I do think there is this piece to side-by-side friendship. And recently we were having a dinner party at my house, and there were like 18 women and 3 men. And my dad wanted to turn on the TV to be able to sit next to the other men. And my mom was like, no, it's a dinner party. We should all be talking. And he's like, I don't know these other men here. And he was like, Carolina, can you come over? And can you turn on the TV so that it's you that turned it on? It's not me. And so then finally, like, I turned on football for them, and they sat next to each other. And as the football was going, my dad started making small talk with them. And then they got in a really interesting conversation. But it was as this sense of the screen was a crutch in case the conversation didn't go well, that they could just focus back on the game rather than like start figuring out about how the other person's kids are doing, or be vulnerable in that way. That I was watching this dining room table filled with women looking at each other face to face. And then the living room 5 feet away had the guys all sitting next to each other on a couch watching football. But it's not inherently bad to go sit on the couch, watch football. It's okay, and now strike up a conversation. Like, work those muscles of having a conversation with a guy, trying to figure out more than just talking about the game.
It is such a scary thing to connect with that person with eye contact, it seems like. And, you know, what better thing to do as a strong man than to do a hard, scary thing? You know, let's have some courage. You know, it makes me think of one of my brothers who's a bit more introverted. And he was relaying to me, talking about that with my dad and asking my dad for advice, because my dad did a lot of his work. He had to connect with other people and build relationships. And my dad had an introverted side too. And my dad said, it's easy. Just ask someone a question. People generally love talking about themselves, sometimes to a detriment. Just get them going. And the questions don't have to be super profound to start. You know, you sit down and you're watching a football game together of, do you watch sports growing up? What was that like and where? You know, it might not be the best question, but it'll get someone talking, and then listen to what they're saying and pick up on something. And I think so often we want to build connection that someone will say something and we immediately jump in. We're like, I went to that stadium too. And it disrupts that flow of conversation of just sitting and listening and creating that back and forth of sharing some of that experience. That conversation does not have to be hard, and it can start with the simplest of questions that can lead to building a depth over really a short period of time.
So I want to get to this last question, which I wish we had 2 more hours. But what are some of the things, or what do you love about being a man?
What I love about being a man is this opportunity we have in our culture and society right now to help redefine what it means to be a man. What is masculine? I think often there's this talk about, the provider, and it reverts back to when we were living, in hunting, gathering cultures and societies, and the man was the provider because he went out and got wood or food as well. Well, what about the woman who is providing the life by giving birth, by preparing the food? Of this myth that there is a binary of something that's providing something that's not, changing what that looks like by providing in some of those other traditional ways. Men are fully capable of cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry. I witnessed that growing up, and has, brought into my life that we can do these things that are traditionally gendered roles in a house, but providing for each other in the way that we show up for our partners and our friends, and showing that we care and holding space for them. We are in a cultural fluxion of what, in a lot of regards, but especially around masculinity and what is healthy masculinity, what is not. People would probably label me a soy boy as some bad thing. And I'm like, well, maybe I'm just more in touch with my emotions and have really deep, compassionate, authentic connections with a lot of people around the world. And I love that. And I wish you had that too. And going back to really this first question of one of the hardest things of growing up, being a man and not having those role models, of now being able to be that role model for the young boys in my life and the young girls in my life, to see what a man can be and should be as an individual, in partnership and in community.
Wow, that was beautiful. I just think that you are such a tremendous role model for men. Young men and old men can learn a lot from the way that you have, through your strength and bravery and courage, redefined what it means to be a man in your life, and also having that ripple effect of thinking about the amount of men who see the way you walk through this world and think, oh, I could be a little bit more like that too. And it's not to put you on some pedestal, because pedestals are a dangerous thing to play with, but it's this aspiration to continue to think about vulnerability as a source of strength in this world that I think is what will get us further along. It might not be the fast route, but it is the long game of how to build stronger communities and societies and families. So I'm just so proud to know you, learn from you, and I'm just really excited to see the ways in which we can continue to have these conversations about redefining masculinity and manhood.
And I'm so grateful that you are creating these spaces for these conversations, and that you are exploring such an important topic, and you're bringing men into this space who should come on their own volition, but you are a catalyst that is really helping to change for the long term what the conversation around manliness and masculinity is.
Thank you so much for listening through episode 3 of the Masking Tapes. Your insights, support, and just intention to listen to these conversations about what it means to be a man in the 21st century and what alternative models look like for how to show up in this world means the world. I'm also so excited to continue to grow this podcast, and have recently started an Instagram, which you can follow for more clips from the podcast. It's at maskingtapes.pod. Make sure to share these episodes with your family and friends and anyone in your life who you think needs to hear them. And I'm excited that episode 4 will be coming out very soon, which will be a conversation with our youngest member on the pod so far, a college student. So thank you all, and wishing you health and rest.